Hey, Grandmasters, Mike from the WCA. This is the Week 6 update for the 4 o'clock class. There is a pawn on B3, which you will not see in the game. Why the pawn is on B3? I accidentally pushed a button. Anyway, E4 was played in the game that we studied, and we used the Kaidanov method that Rus and I gave credit to Grandmaster Gregory Kaidanov, who always recommended that you take Grandmaster games, and at some point after the opening, you begin to kind of guess the moves and then compare your answers with other students. The whole purpose is to kind of get the feel for what a Grandmaster is thinking, and then if you miss something, there's an excellent chance that one of your classmates would have picked it up. And that's what we did in the 4 o'clock class. So you birds basically didn't get to play. How sad. Well, you get to play against me next week in the Simul. Good luck, because I don't plan to lose any games again. Anyway, I'm just kidding. E4, E5. Lasker, kind of known for a universal style, was world champion for 27 years. I think that's the record. Nobody's held it longer than that. And what I mean by universal is whatever the position kind of demanded, he was able to play that way. And modern grandmasters obviously can play all facets of the game, but you have to remember these games were played many years ago. This game played in 1909. So these guys didn't quite have the same benefit that we have today with the technology and the access to all the modern games. So we studied this game, which begins here as a Roy Lopez, because we were looking at what we called classical chess. And in the classical school of chess, you can think of some of the ideas and rules that are followed that are pretty well known. Getting the knights and bishops out quickly, not wasting time with pawn moves that don't really serve a purpose, castling quickly, and then opening the center if you have a lead in development, exchanging pieces when you have less space. A lot of these ideas, these classical ideas, show up in this game, and that's really why we gave it a look. Okay, so in the Ruy Lopez here, there are lots of ways for black to continue. A very common way in Scholastic games is after the move pawn a6 is to go for the exchange variation, where you give up the bishop for the knight. White takes back with the d pawn to accelerate the development. You can see how the queen and the bishop are open now. And I just want to show you one way that white can play this position, and it's to go for immediate exchanges, and this has been played a whole bunch of times. So if you go for this trade and trade the queens off, we reach the following position after knight takes d4, and I want to put some highlights on the board. Namely this. You see those pawns on the queen side, the 3 for white and the 4 for black, very common pawn structure. You cannot create a passed pawn with this pawn majority in the endgame. So if you can imagine all of the pieces coming off the board and just kings and pawns roaming around, black will not be able to create a passed pawn. White can defend against that with these 3. And the main problem black has, of course, are these 2 doubled c pawns. But my dear friends, that endgame is a very, very long way away. If the endgame was forced and black had no chance, they would never play the move a6, allowing this exchange in the first place. So let's go back to the position I showed you. Well, if the pawn structure is not great in the endgame for black, then why in heaven's name do you go for this? Well, let's take a look at some highlights. So there's the pawn structure again. Do you guys see anything based on what's left on the board that you think might be good for black? So again, please pause the video. Probably you can just hit your space bar to do that, and then restart it once you come up with an answer. So a couple, and let's put some things on the board here. So if I highlight the 2 bishops at the top, I hope you guys came up with that idea. Those 2 bishops, clearly, if this game opens up, they can do a lot of damage. And again, one of the WCA maxims or principles that we try to get you guys to follow is always count the number of center pawns. So here, with all those exchanges, there's only one pawn left in the middle, and it belongs to white, but it almost doesn't matter who it belongs to if you have two bishops. I hope you guys understand what I mean by that. Having two bishops and an open center almost guarantees you play. So that's one bit of compensation black gets for his structure. Let's take a look at some more. If you look at the pawn structure on the other side, actually this is for white's advantage, not black's. Here, white has what they call a healthy majority. These four pawns are on separate files, meaning with correct play, white can force a passed pawn in the endgame. And what happens very often is the white king will centralize, the black king will come, and at some point white will create a passed pawn that the black king will have to deal with. And when he does, very often you'll see this king, as he's coming up the board, give up the pawn and then run right into this pawn mass and start picking them off long before black can get any counterplay. That's again a long way away. But let me go back here for a minute. I showed you the two bishops, but let's look at some normal developing moves, because this is actually one of the lines. Bishop to d7, bishop to e3, this is all normal stuff. And then castling, which is something of a middle game benefit for black. You see, black is the first to get a rook to the open D file, so they have control of the only open file available. And also, let's put on those same highlights again. Here, those pawns, while damaging in the endgame, are really useful in the middle game. You have an extra pawn to protect your king. And I think you guys know all of these, okay? So why am I showing you this? Themes constantly repeat themselves in chess. So rather than having you memorize opening after opening without knowing the ideas, I really feel it's important that you understand structure first, and that when you examine a pawn structure, you then begin to look at both sides, comparing what it is they have in the position that they can both play with. Now understand, as you get to 12, 13, 1400, you should pretty much stop hanging pieces for no reason, because at the 4 o'clock class, if you guys are just going to hang a piece, we don't really have anything to talk about. So here, once you begin to understand what's in it for both sides, you're on your way to improvement. Okay, let's look at a little bit more. After knight f6, the move played in the game, so black did not go for that a6 move. Lasker castles, and black plays bishop to e7. Now, alternatively, black could have went for what's known as the open Ruy Lopez by taking the pawn on e4, allowing white to open the game. And part of what's known as the Berlin defense, and again, please don't memorize the names or the moves. I just want to show you a very popular way for black to handle this. The knight goes back, takes, taking on e5, hitting the knight, knight goes to f5, and off come the queens. Okay, does any of this look familiar to you? What's in it for both sides? The pawn structure is identical, except for the fact that the white e-pawn is up one box, but pretty much so much of what we talked about already is in this position. Put on some highlights. Look at the structure. Look at the two bishops. The only difference in this case is the black king cannot castle, and it might be slightly more inconvenient getting this rook in the corner out, because if the king steps out, he's going to be interfering with one of his bishops, or if he takes a step here, he may interfere with this rook at some point. But that's part of the compensation built into the position. White has better structure. Right now, a king comfortably castled, and black is going to have to figure out a way to unwind his pieces in order to take advantage of his two bishops. Okay? So, I hope you understand why we're spending time looking at a structure that did not occur in this game. Okay, so back to the game. After it castles, Kohn, Lasker's opponent, plays bishop e7. And playing the Ruy Lopez this way is playable for black, so black is kind of getting into a crouch, kind of keeping everything solid and not opening the game yet. Lasker continues classically, and we tested you saying, well, what would that mean exactly? He played knight c3, just developing another minor piece, and now here black plays the move pawn to d6. On pawn to d6, we have what's known as a Philidor pawn structure. And the Philidor pawn structure is often recognized as having pawns on c7, d6, and e5 in king pawn openings. So you see the pawn wedge in the middle of the board, and then you notice the chain going back towards c7. Another indication that you're in some sort of Philidor structure is the dark squared bishop being inside that chain. Very often when that happens, the way to take advantage of that is to open the game with the move d4. And that's exactly what Lasker did. However, I'm not done with the structure yet. If you go back to move 1, e4, e5, knight f3, a very common way, well, I shouldn't say common, it's not as common as the other mainline openings, but it's played a lot, is the move d6 right away on move 2. Does that look familiar? It's a Philidor structure, right? Yeah, I'll turn this back on. You guys see that? So here, after the Philidor, you notice that the dark square bishop is locked in, and you have that pawn chain from e5 running down to c7. So what do you think a lot of players with white do? You guessed it, d4. And again, for the same reasons, to take advantage of having more space, try to knock out black's middle pawn. It's exactly what happens in this game. So as soon as Cohn played d6, Lasker immediately lashes out with d4. Okay, the crouch continues. Hope you know what I mean by crouching. Black plays bishop to d7 with kind of covering up and preventing the move d5 from being so devastating, because there is a pin here, and sometimes when this pawn comes in here hitting a pin piece, you could have some serious issues. The move d5 is more than playable, and by the way, if it is played, very often the knight just retreats back to his home square. And to improving players, that kind of move looks ridiculous. It's like, how could you undevelop the piece and literally put it back where it started? Well, you can get away with it here. Did anyone in the room happen to notice how many center pawns are on the board? All 4. And not only are they all on the board, they're completely locked up. So when you have 2 pawn wedges like you do here, e4, e5, d5, d6, the black king could technically stay in the center a lot longer than he normally could if the board were to completely open. I hope that makes sense. Let's go back to that position I showed you here. Remember the exchange variation? Okay, well, if we got hit with this position, there's only 1 center pawn left. And here, you need to get the pieces out pretty quickly because the board is open. But back in the position that I just showed you, here, you can get away with retreating your knight because the board is closed. And by the way, these 2 pawns are firmly locked on light squares, which makes this bishop maybe not so great. So what a lot of players will do is they'll trade it, but our friend, this knight up here on b8 that went backwards, actually comes out. And I'll show you another little positional trick. Let's say you play a move like bishop g5, which seems kind of standard, you know, bringing the piece into the game. And then you'll sometimes see black play these funny pawn moves, like a5. Most of the time, it is not designed to lift the rook, because you see, if you lift the rook, it's kind of awkward. You don't really want this rook in a box. But do you guys know why that move a5 is played? If you don't, you can pause the video. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with our friend, this horse. And, well, hopefully you paused. I didn't hear anything, but I'm assuming you did. Say queen d2. That connects the white rooks, and then the knight hops into c5, and it's really tough getting rid of that knight. The move a5 is designed to stop you from kicking the horse with b4. Not that you'd want to kick a horse. But here you can see that you can't. And all of a sudden, the nature of this game has completely changed. Completely changed. All right, let's get back to the game. I am going to be asking you guys to watch this video in 2 parts. It's long, and it has so much of what we talked about in the 4 o'clock class built into it. So taking it all in one sitting is probably not a good idea. So if you want to pause now and come back, but at some point you may want to watch this in 2 parts. Okay, let's get back to our game. As soon as black did that cover-up move, bishop d7, Lasker's demonstration, bishop to g5, is just a perfect example of classical chess. Keep the pawn tension in the middle, develop the last piece, and wait to see what happens. So here you have to watch out sometimes now for black getting hit with bishop takes knight and then losing some control over the e5 square. You can see that white is hitting it a number of times. So sometimes to avoid that, they now take on d4, which releases the tension. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's just go back a move. Imagine these 2 pawns were people, or, you know, contestants in some game show. They're kind of staring at each other. They're leering at each other. And whenever pawns are in contact in a game, they call it pawn tension. And it's hard to play sometimes with tension on the board because you don't know when it's going to be released. Are you going to do it? Is black going to do it? Is white going to push past? It makes it difficult to calculate. So here, to relieve some of that pressure, black decides to just take the pawn to get rid of the problem. But when Lasker takes back, he creates a position where black now has less space. Black castles, and here white decides to make a trade that will temporarily compromise the black structure. He takes the knight with the bishop, and he gives black sort of a choice. If you take here, then I can take your bishop and then give you this compromised pawn structure, or I could hop my knight into f5, come after your other bishop, and this is a pretty good knight, right, my friends? If you try to kick it, I could trade bishops, knight for bishop, and then you'll have these weak dark squares hanging around your king. This bishop might be able to get in there, okay? So when he took here, black said, you know what, I'll take back with the pawn. I'll keep the 2 bishops, and I have good control of this rank with my pawn structure, and let's play chess. And it's perfectly playable for both sides. After queen d3, I remember Grandmaster Kashishvili telling me once that moves like this, they don't just connect the rooks, but they protect your space. See, the e-pawn is telling white, look, I'm your lead pawn. All the space behind me belongs to you, and you should have some freedom based on the fact that you have a pawn out this far. Black, if you look carefully, only has pawns here on the 3rd rank. Are they weak pawns? Well, yes and no. The c-pawns are double, but these pawns are controlling really good squares. And white having 2 knights, they kind of like those forward squares, but these pawns are taking them away. But you do notice that the black pieces have to live inside 3 ranks, meaning they kind of live in a smaller apartment. And sometimes if you have too many people in a small space, they start to bark at each other because they can't move. So because of that space advantage, black decides to trade pieces. Very common theme in chess. When you're lacking space, very often a trade of pieces helps you. Okay, and remember, there's a lot of material in this video. Make sure that you watch this twice or in 2 parts so that you kind of remember a lot of the things that we covered in class this term. Okay, Lasker goes for the trade, and then here starts to find his middle game plan. Middle game planning, oh my goodness, if I could only imagine how many books were written on the middle game in chess. It is by far the most complicated part of the game to play. Here, it's not always so clear. What am I supposed to do? Lasker played a move again as an improving player. If you saw it for the first time, you might say, I don't get it. He played rook to e1. Having the rook on e1 sort of looks funny because you're leaving the f rook sitting there boxed in. But there's a really, really clear reason why he wants that rook on f1 is in the future he wants to play the move f4. And we'll talk about that when you see it, okay? So if you're playing a strong player and you see them locking in a rook, very often they're either protecting the pawn ahead of it, or more likely they plan to push it, because most masters do not want their rooks to be babysitters. They would prefer that they support the pawn as it advances up the board. Okay, so part of Black's plan was not only to trade pieces, but to get active here, and they played a very active queen h4. The threat should be pretty clear, and it kind of gives Black an opportunity here to say to White, hey, do you want to just chase my knight? You could, but I may end up on this square attacking your queen, gaining a tempo. All of a sudden, my bishop is pointing at your pawn. My queen is here. My knight is here. I might play f5 at some point, really opening the game, and get some play against you. That's all I want. So after queen h4, Lasker found knight f3, which was a very nice way to stop both threats. The knight coming to e5 and obviously stopping the checkmate. And the added bonus is it wins a tempo against the queen. The queen went to h5, and now Lasker plays h3. That will give his king a square for the middle game, for Luft, which is German for air, but the way I pronounced it, I probably said, I don't know, caterpillar maybe in German? Can anyone say caterpillar in German? I have no idea what I'm talking about. So after h3, the knight goes to e5 anyway, and that kind of fell right into Lasker's hands. He played knight takes. And when he takes, you'll see I highlighted the bishop up there on d7. It's loose. It's an unprotected piece. So after knight takes e5, you can all see that you can't take with the d-pawn. You'll lose the bishop, which forces the queen to take. And once the queen took, that gave Lasker the chance to play f4, creating the pawn duo. He got hit with a check, but he was okay with that because he had already played this h3 move, puts his king where? h1 or h2. Well, as a general principle, if you can't decide between the two, having it on h2 does get him one step closer to the center in case some endgame breaks out, and then tactically you stay off the color of the opposing bishop. Here, I'm not sure the white squares can be opened up so easily, but it kind of felt right to have that king on h2. Okay, Black is not going to sit and let you just carry on. He doesn't like this duo, because this duo is taking space, and you can imagine this pawn advancing to f5 and then even to f6 someday, creating a pawn wedge on the 6th rank, which can be deadly. We've discussed that many times this year. So he plays bishop to e6, and if you're not paying attention and you blindly just push this pawn, you're going to get hit with bishop c4 skewering the queen. So Lasker stopped the threat. But how? Okay, he came up with the move b3. Now, that weakens a whole bunch of dark squares on the queen side, but in this position, those dark squares were not really an issue. Here is where Black makes his first mistake. He plays the move f5. And I'm saying it's a mistake because he was probably better served pushing the pawn to f6, getting really good control of e5, which stops this pawn from moving so easily. And if f5 comes, the bishop can tuck itself in on f7, and kind of cover the white squares here. And all of a sudden, the bishop's not looking so bad anymore. Things are beginning to open up. And then, more importantly, where exactly is this knight going? It's not coming into e5, and, things are probably okay here for black. But what he did in the game by playing f5 is he put a pawn on a light square that ended up getting locked. Lasker played e5, and that pawn cannot be taken. If you take it, you're going to get hit with rook takes e5, hitting the bishop and the queen. Essentially, queen e7 is forced, and you're running into things like queen e3. And the more you defend your bishop, the more I attack it. The more pieces you bring in defense, the more pieces I'll find to attack it. And eventually, we're going to reach some position like this, and this is not pleasant at all for black. I will pause you the rest. You can go through it if you like. Okay, so after the move f5 was played, e5, as I mentioned, well, to avoid that catastrophe, Cohn played d5, and from here ended up getting in a real pickle. Because why do they say pickle? How come they never say I'm in a real cucumber? That bothers me. They go, oh, I was in a real pickle today. I was in trouble. They never say cucumber. I find it offensive. Anyway, after that move, knight a4. Not to win the queen. At this level, you're not going to have your opponent just give you a free queen. Queen e7, and now queen d4. The whole reason for white's play is to clamp down on the c5 square. Rook f to b8, keeping an eye on this pawn with the other rook, and now simply knight c5, creating what's known in the chess world as a bind. This entire structure cannot move, and it's basically impossible to get rid of this knight unless you give up a rook for it, which is what happened in the game. Pawn a5, trying to weaken white's structure, and white very calmly plays the move a3. And a3 is there just in case you push past. He's going to play b4, and he's going to keep this knight again locked on the square. Out came the king, and then Lasker did a nice little shift. Rook a1, anticipating those lines opening up, because the only other pawn break on the board is over here, and I'm not sure the black king wants to open this part of the board. So Cohn decides to play on the queen side, and his plan was to win the exchange. I'm sorry, to give up the exchange. Rook a to b8, c3, holding on to the structure, and here he gives up a rook for a knight and a pawn, because after rook to b5, he is going to get a pawn for that. But the file is challenged. Queen took, and rather than rushing with the queen trade, he just played the move a4, and in this position, black resigns. He could have taken here, by the way, and you could have had some kind of position like this, but white is going to get pretty active pretty quickly. But going back here, folks, if you just stare at this position after a4, and you'll realize that black is not going to get enough compensation, because in terms of material, they're only down a point, I think, right? They got a pawn for the exchange, but the big problem here is white's rook is going to dominate a file at some point, and the bishop, while it does protect the pawns, is really just a big pawn himself. Okay, again, this was the longest video of the year. I hope you learned something from it, and go over the bullet points in the blog, and watch it more than once. This is basically a recap of a lot of what we talked about this semester. Okay, you guys have been absolutely awesome. I learned a lot as a teacher and as a player hanging out with you guys. All right, I will see you on Sunday for the simul.